Okay, we are now live. All right,
Excellent.
so we have here with us Lincoln Cannon, one of the co-founders of the Mormon Transhumanist Associations, and he wrote a pretty cool book recently called The Consolation, which is like a transhumanist version of the King Follet Sermon. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's a good intro.
Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So my educational background's in philosophy and business, both of those degrees from Brigham Young University. Professionally, I've worked in the software industry for a few decades, most recently as an entrepreneur doing e-commerce and software consulting, building software as a service platforms, stuff like that. And then one of the things that people usually find most interesting about me is that I've been involved in the transhumanist movement for a long time now. And I'm one of the founders of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, also one of the founders of the Christian Transhumanist Association, and served as the president of the MTA, the Mormon Transhumanist Association, for 10 years. Currently, I am an advisor to the MTA and a board member for the CTA, the Christian Transhumanist Association. So a lot of experience. I've written a lot, blogged a lot, have articles in peer-reviewed journals and various peer-reviewed publications about religious transhumanism. So I have a strong background there that a lot of people find either interesting. Some people find it weird or scary, but a lot of people find it interesting.
Why would it be scary?
Well, it's scary because transhumanism talks about how humanity is changing and has changed and will change.
Right, and everybody's
probably.
always afraid of change. So
People
you
are
never know
afraid
what's
of
going to do with
change. And also, there are a lot of people who feel deeply that their religion, their inherited culture has something really important to say about ways that humans maybe should or shouldn't change. And they often feel like transhumanism is an affront to that worldview, to those values. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes their value systems are incompatible with transhumanism. Often they have a straw man of transhumanism in mind. That so you know, if that's the case, there some reconciliation is usually possible, and often much reconciliation. But there are cases when people just fundamentally look at the world and value the world in a way that just doesn't work with transhumanists, and they can become frightened or angry by the propositions that transhumanists forward.
Right. It's a very liberal thinking ideology, would you say?
It is in the, I would say it's liberal in the traditional sense, not necessarily in the political sense. In the political sense,
Right.
transhumanists across the spectrum.
Let's try to keep politics out of it, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely something like that. So something that I think is really fascinating about your own story is the fact that you grew up a member of the church and then you had a bit of a falling away and then you came across transhumanism and you're like a light bulb just went off in your head and you're like, wow, this is a perfect way to explain Mormonism. You want to get a little bit into that?
Yeah. So I grew up as a pretty analytical child and had, various doubts and skepticisms and disagreements and such with my church and religion, with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Mormonism. And my parents were patient with my skeptical questions. My dad would talk to me about it without ever trying to demonize me or shame me. But all in all, throughout my childhood, I still maintained a general inclination towards faith and belief, and ended up serving a mission for the church. After my mission, however, my father, who had been sick with cancer a few times, finally succumbed to his third cancer. And I kind of confronted the problem of evil. So nothing novel. Like half of humanity
Mm-hmm.
has dealt with this, if not all of humanity. Um, and when I confronted the problem of evil at a point in my life when somebody that I loved dearly had just died from a really painful disease, I just at the time I couldn't believe anymore. Um, and I didn't go out and like attack the church or have a vendetta against other Mormons. In fact, to the contrary, I kept attending church. I didn't publicly identify as an atheist. Publicly, I would still tell people that I was trying to express faith by going to church, living the principles of the church, because I generally agreed with the practical principles of the church. I thought it was a good way to live. I just couldn't believe that God existed. And of course, there's a lot of things that cascade from that central kind of assertion or non-assertion of existence. And really the challenge was even deeper in some ways. It was something of an existential crisis for me. And that sounds melodramatic unless you've gone through one and you know that when you're in it, it's not so melodramatic.
I've been through, it feels like, several existential crises.
There you go. And while we can talk about it from the outside and smile and say and pat ourselves on the head and say, oh yes, my existential crisis, when you're in it, it's really, well, it's unmooring, it's disconcerting, it's everything breaks away.
Just weighs down on you.
Yeah. And so as a kind of, as a closet atheist, having my existential crisis, I was a young adult. I was only around 22 years old at the time. I was a new father, newly married, new father, just getting started in the professional world. So lots of financial stresses. It was a tough time for me. And during that period of time, I was searching and working hard on myself, trying to reestablish a sense of purpose and meaning making for my life. And I followed a few different avenues in that process. One of them, which might surprise some people, is that I decided I wanted to go back and I wanted to read the New Testament from a new perspective, from the perspective of somebody who didn't believe anymore that God existed, but wanted to understand why the text works for people, okay, why the text has the power it has. And so I went back and read it with those eyes. And one of the consequences of that is that I became thoroughly persuaded that the Apostle Paul is an amazing genius. Even if he was wrong about various ontological matters, such as the existence of God, he was a genius on a practical level, and taught powerful, transformative ideas. And I became persuaded of that while I was a closet atheist, more so than ever before, of the practical power of Paul's ideas. Another avenue that I pursued at this time was philosophical. I had encountered and read some of the works of Nietzsche prior to this period of time in my life, and I had also read a little bit of William James, a pragmatist philosopher, prior to this period of my life. But
so this is where you're starting to inch a little bit closer towards transhumanism.
That's right.
When you're reading about Nietzsche's Übermensch.
Yeah, and I was already kind of somewhat familiar with the idea. I had studied. I had a degree in philosophy from Brigham Young University, and we had read some Nietzsche, but I hadn't really read him as extensively as I wanted to, and as I was feeling like I might benefit from. And so at this point in my life, I went back and I read a lot of Nietzsche. I also read a lot of William James, the pragmatist philosopher, and those two influences ended up being really powerful in my life at that point in time. Nietzsche from kind of an existentialist perspective, William James from a pragmatist perspective. Then also at this point in time, I encountered transhumanism through two different vectors that I didn't know were related to each other at the time. One was Ray Kurzweil. I first read an article by him. I think it was titled "How to Live Long Enough to Live Forever," and that led me eventually to his book about the singularity. And I was really impressed by his perspective on the impact of technology on the humanity historically and its potential impact going forward, and on how he had this idea that we would be able to use technology to achieve many of the things that my religion had motivated me, inspired me to desire to achieve, even though I kind of wasn't able to believe anymore that they were possible. Such as, for example, using technology to console and heal people in ways that we had never before imagined, or use technology potentially even to transform our brains and our bodies and our being to become much more intelligent, much potentially even more ethical and compassionate by applying technology within the bounds, of course, of always only being able to make decisions with the ethics and wisdom that we have now. So, you make a bad decision in your interest of enhancing your ethics, well, you can actually make yourself more unethical. But so I encountered transhumanism through Ray Kurzweil, and then simultaneously, I encountered the writings of Nick Bostrom, a transhumanist philosopher, particularly his writings about the simulation argument. And that really inspired me, because here was a guy who was essentially an atheist, who was talking about ways in which we could be living in a created world, very persuasively, in my opinion. And so suddenly I was more persuaded than ever before of the practical power of the gospel of Jesus Christ as Paul presents it in the New Testament. I was deeply thinking about ways of solving existential crises informed of Nietzsche's ideas, ways of living practically and making something meaningful and purposeful out of life based on the ideas of William James. And then I have these transhumanists who are talking about how we can use technology to do those things in powerful, powerful ways that in pretty much all regards parallel the aspirations that I had received through my religious upbringing. And I found myself unable to do anything but seriously reconsider whether I was wrong to have doubted my inherited beliefs. Now, in that period of time, when we change and we learn new things, we never go back and become exactly who we were. But in many ways, many of my inherited beliefs from childhood became more real than ever before, more powerful, more embedded, more believed than ever before. There were nuances, of course, important ones, but my faith became stronger than I had ever before experienced. And my belief, which I consider to be a different matter than faith, also was recreated in ways I did not at all anticipate. I don't believe we can choose our beliefs. I think our beliefs kind of choose us. Now, we can maybe indirectly choose them by, choosing what we look at and what we study and what we don't study and what we don't look at. And so maybe that can influence the trajectory that our beliefs take us. But I really didn't anticipate returning so strongly to my Mormon beliefs. And I did. And so I started talking about that with people in online philosophy forums and with friends. And eventually, a group of us decided that we wanted to take practical action, stemming from this practical approach to religion and to our Mormonism, and try to organize ourselves and others into a movement around the ideas of Mormon transhumanism. And that's how the Mormon Transhumanist Association was born.
Awesome. So let's start getting into the book. why you've gone on record on saying that you think Joseph Smith would be a transhumanist if he was around today,
Yeah.
because there seems to be lots of like transhumanist themes already in his King Follet Sermon.
Yeah, of course, he didn't know. There's no reason to think he knew of the word transhumanist or transhumanism, although the word, I think, did exist at the time he lived. It just was not used by almost anybody. I think Dante used the word
Oh,
transhumani
really?
in the Inferno.
Well,
Um,
I do need to read that book.
there you go. Another reason to read it. So, yeah, Joseph Smith didn't know the word. And of course, the modern ideology of transhumanism didn't exist. That came about in the late 20th century. But if you look at Joseph Smith's ideas, you know, Joseph Smith embraced Christianity, and he embraced it in a very practical and in a very audacious way. The practical side about it was that he emphasized the idea that faith without works is dead. Of course, he inherited that from the Bible and broader Christianity to some extent. Now, there are Christians who have fought against that idea. And the strange thing about fighting against the idea that faith without works is dead is that you're eventually going to lose that fight if you're against the idea of working, right? Because you won't fight. So anyway, he advocated a very practical approach to religion, to Christianity. And the audacious side was that he emphasized the parts of Christianity that connected us in practical and in identifying ways with God. Theosis, the idea that we are the children of God and our potential is to progress and become as God is. And he taught, as Paul teaches over and over again in the New Testament, that Jesus invites us to take on the name of Christ, follow his example, become one with him as he is one with God, and thereby participate in the glory of God. Now, there's some challenges, of course, there's some complexities to that. Like Jesus says, hey, you can be one with me and be a joint heir with me in the glory of God, but you have to participate in suffering with me. That's kind of the qualification on it. You have to reconcile with me. You have to atone with me. And so that there's some deeply soul-stretching issues at play in all of this. And Joseph, of course, talks about all of those things. The gospel of Jesus Christ is, of course, center to everything Joseph did. But at the same time, he's talking about a practical approach to godhood. He's not vying away from technology. He's not vying away from work. He's building temples. He's building wagons. He's building cities. If computers existed, I guarantee he would have been using computers. He was using printing presses. And then the saints, after Joseph's death, persisted in that. Brigham Young persisted in using technology to build and to expand, to basically terraform what would eventually become the state of Utah. And so Mormons have inherited from our ancestors and from our cultural antecedents all of these, this very positive action-oriented approach to the world and to technology and to working. And when you couple that with the idea that humanity can and should become God in compassion and in courage and in creativity and in power and glory, when you couple those ideas, you are essentially talking about transhumanism in function.
Right. All right. Awesome. So I guess let's talk. So talking about the book, then let's give a bit of an introduction as to like what inspired you to like want to make a transhumanist version of the King Follet Sermon. I know it had a lot to do with your father and grandmother, and you wanted a way to honor their memory and provide answers to the people that are maybe grieving their own loved ones, and like help them to console, I guess, as the book is called.
That's right. Yeah.
So it all goes back to that idea that Joseph Smith emphasized a lot, that the hearts of the children will turn to the fathers and the fathers will turn to the children, and we'll want to be saviors with them.
Yeah. In his last general conference sermon, Joseph Smith's last General Conference sermon, he chose to talk about deification, humanity becoming God, how that works, and why it matters. People have since called that sermon the King Follet Sermon, but what a lot of people don't know or don't keep in mind is this was his last General Conference sermon, a few months before he was killed.
Like a few months after.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And he explains in his sermon, in my opinion, very powerfully, very, very eloquently, that the reason why it matters that humanity can and should become God, that we should become gods the same as all other gods have done before, to quote him, is because in this process, we change and we gain the power to help each other and ultimately raise the dead. His effort in this speech is not merely to say, hey, look how cool you and I who are alive can become. It is, look how wonderfully reconnecting this power can be for us and our loved ones, including the loved ones that we have lost. Because the power of godhood is about reconciliation, about consoling and healing. It's about raising each other, including our dead. And so when he talks about this progress, grace by grace, from our present capacities to the capacities of godhood, he talks about that culminating ultimately in the resurrection of the dead. That's like the apex of power, as he describes it. The apex of the divine manifestation, the resurrection of the dead. When we have the ability to raise our loved ones from the dead and rejoin with them and continue in society and in love and in relationship with them. So he explains that in his mind, and I agree with him, a knowledge, a faith in such things is essential to consolation when we lose our family and friends, when they die. And if ever, if the world doesn't change fast enough and we happen to get to that point where we have to join our family and friends in the tomb, and there's also consolation that the people we're leaving behind, we may yet be able to see them again too, even though we're the ones leaving. And so there's some powerful consolation in that. Now, interestingly, Joseph Smith also does some things in this sermon that are a little bit odd from a Christian perspective, at least from what has become the more mainstream Christian perspective.
Sure. Well,
and one of those is that Joseph Smith characterizes God in existentialist terms. Joseph describes the origin of God and the gods as one in which the gods find themselves in the midst of spirits and matter. They see that they are more intelligent than others. So they set about instituting laws whereby others can progress to become more like them, more intelligent like they are. This isn't a description of God where God is, some kind of absolute in the beginning. This is a description of gods that find themselves in the midst of stuff, that experience themselves much as perhaps we first experienced ourselves in childhood, if we go back to our earliest memories.
It definitely makes sense, because as Joseph Smith gets into it, the word create doesn't actually mean create out of nothing. It means to organize, like you would organize materials to build a ship. God couldn't find himself if he was just in the middle of nothing. There would be nothing to reflect upon. And so he required those pre-existing materials to say, oh, I recognize myself as more intelligent than these things, and now I can organize and arrange these things to become more like me.
Yes. And and think about the practical consequences of characterizing God in this way, coupled with the idea that we are called to become God, to join God, not to replace God, to join God, and not just any God, God as modeled after the example of Jesus Christ, the compassionate, courageous, creative God. So when we combine this existential theology with theosis in a practical way, think about how that informs the way that we should anticipate finding consolation for the difficulties and suffering in our lives. It's not that God is going to come and solve everything for us. It's that we are called to work with God in solving everything for each other. That we're all in this together. That if there is darkness, it's up to us to turn on the light. If there's meaninglessness, it's up to us to create meaning and purpose. It's up to us to have a conversation, to initiate the language, to write the code or the book. It's up to us to make relationships and to be true to those relationships, because there's nothing that compels any of that to have any meaning. We're in this with God as co-creators.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So something that I feel like your book really touches on that is my personal formulation for why I believe in God is the idea that if the possible God can't exist, then God himself can't exist, because it wouldn't be possible. But at the same time, if God does exist, then so does the possible God. That if we can become like God, then we were already God, kind of an idea.
Yeah, I have quite a few friends who value the idea quite a bit, that in some important way we're already God. My own approach to that is that I have something of a panpsychist leaning, and I also think that there's good reason to suppose that if we're living in a created world, as I trust is the case, that the world is computed on the substrate of the body of God. In other words, we in a very real way are living within God, in the same way that software is in a computer inside the hardware. And if that's the case, then maybe, and this is of course speculation, but speculation that I like, maybe what happens when we are born, when we're conceived and birthed into this world, is that our minds individuate from the mind of God. Our bodies shape what is pervasively the mind of God around us into something that has its own agency to some significant extent, not an absolute extent. And that through this process, we have an opportunity to start to progress independently, somewhat independently, from God. And that's the whole point. That's how the children of God are created and educated with the potential, the purpose of developing into fully fledged, fully formed godhood at some, I don't know, distant point in the future, perhaps, and perhaps not so distant, depending on how rapidly some things change. But yeah, I do think that there's a sense in which, an important sense in which we come from God, and an important sense in which we are going toward God, but will be different in the process. I think we were probably less individuated when we began, and will be more individuated when we end.
Definitely. So you talk about God as superhuman, which is a very Nietzschean idea, right? Nietzsche thought that the new God should be a superhuman, like a man who has elevated to the next stage of evolution. So, like, would you say that's how you see God? That he is exactly like us. He's a superhuman, and that he's this ultimate ideal that we should always be striving towards.
Uh, yes, more or less. So Joseph Smith himself said that, hey, the great secret is that if you could see God now, you would see that God is a human in yonder heavens, right? And that God became God, the same as all other gods have done before. So in a very literal sense for Joseph Smith, God is superhuman. God was once like we are now, and became an exalted being, exalted in intelligence and compassion and creativity. And that's our potential, as Joseph Smith teaches. So, what a qualification I would put on that is that historically, we've often had a tendency to speak of God in terms of only the Father, the male part of God.
Right. Much of Christianity has forgotten about the mother.
Yeah. And
which
of
is
course, Mormons haven't. We haven't forgotten. We do talk about Heavenly Mother, but I don't think we talk about Heavenly Mother enough. And so when we talk about becoming like God and what God is, my preferred approach to that is to remind myself and others that what we are becoming is a divine community, a divine family, where men and women and all of us in our differing capacities and different personalities have an opportunity to participate in this heavenly community, and that it's communities, not just individuals, that become God. That I think it's all there in Joseph Smith's teachings, and Joseph Smith very clearly taught a plurality of gods explicitly. That's his expression, plurality of gods. He very explicitly taught of a mother in heaven, and I just think that we can use a reminder in the modern church to take advantage of those teachings and remind each other, because so often we get a somewhat impoverished view of God if we only talk about part of Godhood.
Mm-hmm. And Joseph Smith really seems to get into the mother aspect of all this when he starts talking about, will mothers have children in the afterlife, right?
Yeah. And his answer, of course, is yes, a resounding yes. And he offers some strange ideas as he's speculating about it, and I have no idea if they'll prove true or not. But what I do embrace from a perspective of faith, practical faith, the kind of faith where we work to contribute to making it so, is that the future toward which we as humanity are headed is not one of simplicity and sameness and homogeneity. It's a future of wondrous diversity. And that if we think that our gender differences might somehow go away into a post-gendered neutrality of some bizarre sort, I think I've got news for you. I deeply doubt that. It seems far more likely that we will preserve the complexity we have and embellish upon it. So, do I think that there are fathers and mothers in heaven? Absolutely. I can imagine nothing less complex and beautiful as being possible, and I imagine it's even far more than that.
Right, definitely. Like what he said, gender is eternal, and it's a very, it seems to be a very key component to evolution in general, that the only way we evolve is with two opposites coming together and then birthing the next generation.
Yeah, I think there's something really important to
There's a reason why asexual animals have a hard time evolving.
Yeah, there have been reproductive benefits, evolutionary benefits through having multiple genders. I want to carefully acknowledge to my friends who are queer that, so far as I'm concerned, there's plenty of room in the divine community for them as well. And I want to emphasize that also does not diminish the value of what is prominently a bigendered human construct right now. These are super challenging social issues for many people at this point in time. And my position is that we're trying to create something beautiful, and all of us have something to contribute to that Zion community, that celestial glory. And I don't think it's only people who fit into what is our most commonly recognized gender roles. I don't think that our commonly recognized gender roles are unimportant at all. I think they're very important, but I don't think that they're exhaustive of what's good about humanity.
There needs to be room to evolve.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So let's move into more so about the how to console the mourners. So we talked about the resurrection, how like you can put faith in the fact that at some point we're going to be resurrecting the dead, from all the names we've been putting into the temple. In the book, you talk about this weird thing called what is it, microscopic archaeology or something like that?
Quantum archaeology.
Yeah, quantum archaeology. So how do you imagine the resurrection process being like?
Well, so first, let me just say that quantum archaeology is an expression that some transhumanists and other futurists use to describe speculative technologies of the future, where we may be able to mine time and space for information about the past, use that information that we mine to reconstruct models of the past and the present, and then substantiate them into some kind of embodied form. If it's a person, right, give them a brain and body that sufficiently matches the brain and body they had historically, and reconnect them to consciousness. And if you don't see any problems in God getting the right spirit into the right embryo when we procreate, then I think we can find a solution to getting the right spirit in the right body when we technologically resurrect people. But the question you asked kind of goes beyond that. How do I envision that resurrection happening? Quantum archaeology is like just a speculative kind of catch-all term. I actually think that there's a very practical approach to technological resurrection. And Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in particular, is on the forefront of that very practical approach, even without knowing so, for the most part. And that is that family history and genealogical work are the best way that we've got to get started, given the technology that we have right now. Why is that? Well, they are basically keying the database for the resurrection and motivating us to continue doing that work. And here's a thought experiment. Let's say that a family historian comes along and creates a very crude, simple model of an ancestor, one of his ancestors, and stores that model on his computer. We might call that model a profile in a genealogical database, right? That model might just be a name and a picture. Very simple model of a dead person. Another genealogical researcher comes along and looks at that model and says, oh, I can improve on that. I can add more detail. I can add more pictures. Maybe I have some video and audio of that person. And that model becomes more detailed, a stronger, more robust model. And let's say somebody else improves on that and makes and uses artificial intelligence to extrapolate from those videos and those photos and those texts into a moving, speaking model of that person. And then let's say another genealogical researcher comes after that with some technology that we don't have yet, because we have all the technologies I've talked about so far. Those exist. We're doing all those things. Somebody comes along with yet more technology that can make that model even better in some way that we haven't fully imagined yet. And let's say that process continues to repeat itself indefinitely. If there's no hard limit to the detailedness of the models that we can generate for our dead ancestors, if there's no hard limit to our ability to reach into time and space and collect the information that we need, and it might be very hard, it might take technologies that we don't yet have to access some of the things we need. But if there is no hard limit, then ultimately the practical, natural consequence of the family history project is a literal resurrection of the dead. And that's what the church has been doing for 150 years.
All right, awesome. So we're already on the way to doing that. So we gather up the DNA of ancient our ancestors, and then we recreate them or something like that. Or
I think DNA it can serve a very valuable function in all of this. DNA won't be sufficient on its own, right? DNA alone would only make a clone, but that's still an important part of it. We would need DNA. We may be able to extrapolate a lot of important things from photographs and videos and audio recordings and texts that the people wrote. We may need to look at the environment in which the person lived and extrapolate back to that person from social things, family things that we know about the time and place where they lived. And we may need other technologies that we don't have right now for looking back in time, essentially mining time and space, quantum archaeology, to use the vague term. If you go 1,000 light years away from Earth and you look back at Earth, what do you see? Well, you see Earth 1,000 years ago. So information persists. The problem is with entropy is that it becomes harder and harder to access.
Sure.
And so the question is, how much information can we preserve? How much information can we access from the past, and will it be enough? Joseph Smith, in the 128th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, says that God ordained, before the creation of our world, that which would enable us to redeem our dead. Now, most members of the church think that Joseph was only talking about maybe baptism for the dead. I think that that was just the beginning of what God ordained that would enable us to redeem our dead. I think God created a possibility space that in time, according to our efforts, and according to our faith, will reveal to us increasingly powerful ways that we can access the information we need to ultimately perform the ordinance of resurrection for our dead ancestors.
Whatever form that might take, I guess.
Yeah.
And in general, it is a very beautiful concept that I think should be the driving force for progress, where we're constantly thinking about our ancestors and honoring their memories and doing what we can to preserve their memory and all that kind of stuff, and push forward into the future. And maybe one day we'll have a time machine, get so advanced that we'll have a time machine that we can literally look back on them.
Yeah, and we wouldn't even need a time machine in the kind of macro scale science fiction, popular science fiction sense. All you need is the kind of time machine that can pull information from the past, nuggets, and only a statistically sufficient amount. And you don't have to be perfect. Like when I went to bed last night and I woke up this morning, my physical anatomy was different. I'm not the same person exactly in every detail that I was when I went to bed last night. And over a day or a week, a month, a year, a decade, my anatomy is very different. But there's something psychosocially sufficient in what I've maintained that allows people around me and myself, when I look in the mirror, to say, that is Lincoln Cannon.
Sure.
It's psychosocially sufficient, but it doesn't require absolutes. It doesn't require all the information. It just requires enough, whatever that is.
Sure. There's always that, we could talk about the ship of Theseus paradox and how we're constantly changing and all that. But I think fundamentally there's always going to be that one central core that fundamentally makes you, and philosophers, of course, have been debating that for centuries, what makes a soul, kind of an idea. But I think what's most interesting about Joseph Smith is he says that the soul is the spirit and body, like
Yeah,
together. And he talks about how the spirits that don't have bodies, they feel like they're imprisoned, that they don't have any, they can't do anything. They don't have any agency like people that have bodies can do.
that's exactly right. And that's powerful, right? Because that says, hey, listen, it's not enough to think of heaven as a place you go when we die. No. Maybe when we die, we de-individuate back into God to some extent. I think the dead still continue to exist. I don't know how much volition they still have. And clearly scriptures suggest that they have less agency than we have, as you pointed out. But heaven in Mormon theology, in Mormon eschatology, is when we are resurrected physically in an embodied way. That is heaven, because our bodies empower us with individuated agency.
All right, awesome. So I guess, is there anything else you want to add in with everything that we've been talking about? Going over we've been going over a couple of things that you mentioned in the book. Is there anything else we didn't mention that you want to bring up?
Oh man, there's a gazillion things related to all of this that we could talk about, but
there's one thing I did want to bring up. I think it's beautiful how when you compare God to superhuman, or when you call God superhuman, you take that famous commandment that Jesus gave, where he says, "Love God with all your heart, mind, and strength," and you replace God with superhuman, like loving the perfect, exceptional being with all our heart, mind, and strength that we might one day advance to become. And so it puts that kind of idea into perspective, where you still love, where loving man is like loving humans as they are now, and loving God is loving as humans can be.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's what Jesus meant. I don't think that is a change to Jesus's intent. I think it's an illumination of it in light of the doctrine of theosis that's on almost every page of the New Testament. What could it possibly mean to love God with our entire soul? If God is what we should become and join with, that means that what we're loving with our entire soul is what we can become, not what we are now. What we can become, that we must change, that we must repent, that we must change spiritually, we must change physically, that we must love and lift each other, become one, reconcile with each other, and that in so doing become God, become superhumanity.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely beautiful. So with all of this, is there anything in particular that you have any doubts on, or you're full gun ho on all this stuff?
I have doubts about everything. I'm an analytical person, but doubt is not the driving emotion or cognitive position for me in my life. It hasn't been for a long time now. I cannot emphasize enough how empowering and liberating and joyful, it would even be the right word, it is to live with practical faith. You don't have to know everything.
Faith doesn't have to be blind.
That's right. It doesn't. In fact, I would argue that blind faith isn't faith if it's intentionally blind. It's not faith at all if it's intentionally blind. But faith is using what we do know to the extent we think we know things, because we're always wrong to some extent. But it's using what we do experience, what we do observe, what we do feel like we know, and that's what knowledge is a feeling. So what we do know, even if we're wrong, it's using all of that to, according to whatever wisdom and inspiration we have, to make a better world, to make better relationships, to improve our brains and our bodies. and to help others do the same thing, to live with greater happiness, greater love, more courage. Courage is a huge aspect of what faith actually is. I think, in fact, courage may be a better word for some of this than the archaic word faith. Courage suggests that we don't know everything, that some things do scare us, that some things are hard, that there will be suffering. But courage, despite all of that, looks at the beautiful possibilities ahead of us and says, we're going to work on that. I am going to work on that. And I'm going to try to support others who are working on that and persuade others to work on that. And we will work on this together. And by the grace of God, we will make that world. By the grace of God. Now, it has to be possible. It might not be, but we have to trust it is. We're wasting our time otherwise.
Sure.
So by the grace of God, we'll make that world. That's what faith is.
It's almost, I kind of feel like faith is a sort of absurd optimism in a kind of way, where you're just being so optimistic about the future.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be Pollyanna-ish, and it doesn't need to be naive. In fact, it's most powerful when it recognizes all of the real risks, because we can't mitigate those risks unless we actually understand them as well as we can. But once we understand the risks as well as we can, given whatever time constraints we have, because life will not wait. We can't sit around and have perfect answers to everything all the time. That just doesn't work. But we can, to varying extents, analyze, criticize, and understand. When we've done that to the extent that life can permit, then we do need to trust in the best viable possibilities that remain and work towards those. Because when we're running, when we're being chased by the lion or the bear, and there's a cliff ahead of us, and we have to make the 10-foot leap from one side of the canyon to the other, if we tell ourselves, we can't do this, I can't do this, there's so many ways I'm going to fail, that can make all the difference in killing us versus, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it over that. I know it will be hard. I have to jump better than I've ever jumped before. But the only alternatives are being mauled by the bear or falling into the chasm. I'm going to make the leap, and I am going to make it. And so if that's the absurd optimism, then yes, we must have that, but it need not be uninformed.
Sure, definitely. You wouldn't just want to accidentally jump off a cliff. But, I think there's definitely a component of having trained and given yourself enough experience to actually be able to make the jump.
Yeah, we need to do all we can while life gives us the opportunity. So far as grace permits, let's understand, let's analyze, let's criticize, let's debate, let's deliberate. There's nothing wrong with all of that. And in fact, I would argue that we have a moral obligation to engage in all of that. There is the atonement, the reconciliation that Jesus invites us to participate in, is not only a moral thing, it's also an epistemic thing. And I often argue, contend, debate try to persuade people of the idea that science is itself the formalization of epistemic atonement. That science is a way of saying that I value your experience and observation as much as I value my experience and observation. So together we need to contribute those experiences and observations, formulate a hypothesis that accounts for both of them, and then test it together to see if we're right or wrong. Science is a form of atonement. So I think we have a moral obligation even to engage in science so long as we can. But when the time runs out and when life can no longer wait, we need to run and we need to jump.
All right, awesome. Speaking of the atonement, how do you see the atonement of Jesus Christ fitting into all of this?
Paul talks about that a lot in the New Testament. I love the way he talks about it. The atonement, the word that he uses for atonement in the New Testament is reconciliation. And he invites us to participate in that reconciliation as Jesus exemplified. In fact, Paul in Colossians, he talks about it in a very beautiful way. He says that Paul, is filling up that which is behind, or that which lacks, of the atonement of Christ, or the reconciliation of Christ in his own flesh, in Paul's flesh, on behalf of the church, which is the body of Christ. It's kind of a complex passage. It's in, like I said, the beginning of Colossians. The basic idea, though, is that Jesus calls us to share in his suffering, to share in reconciliation with each other, to love each other no matter how hard it is, and try to figure out how to work together for our common good. And that it's going to be hard, it's going to hurt, but we're called to that. And if we will join in that, if we will work to reconcile with each other, if we will work to atone, to become one with each other, there's power in that. There's salvation in that. And so I see atonement not as a magic wand, but as a practical invitation that Jesus exemplifies and invites us into unity with him around, that we should become one and reconciled in the body of Christ, suffering for each other, so that we can raise each other up into godhood.
That's very beautifully said. So with the book, what do you see? What are your hopes for it, with the book?
So far, the book has served the purpose of something of a funerary text. It's been shared. I've shared it. Others have shared it at funerals or memorials.
Okay. So it's already being used like a King Follet Sermon.
Yeah, which of course was Joseph Smith's originals. Although it was a general conference sermon, he was inspired by the death of his friend, King Follet. And his family had asked King Follet's family, and King Follet, by the way, was not royalty for those who are listening. That was just his first name was King. He was a member.
We can still say he was.
There you go. He was royalty in the divine family, as we all ought to be. Anyway, Joseph Smith had been invited by King's family to talk about the resurrection and to talk about things that would help console them from his death. He died younger than he should have, fell into a well, as I recall. And so Joseph Smith talked about that, and that was his purpose, was to console people. And Joseph figured the best way to console people is to tell them about the power that we have in common with God, the potential that we have in common with God, and how we'll use that to redeem our relationships through resurrection. And so this interpretive variation that I've written, which modernizes the text and the ideas in honor of Joseph, not intending to suggest at all that Joseph had any shortcomings in his version. I love his version. Mm-hmm. But in honor of that, in reverence of that, my interpretive variation still has the same intent. Its intent is to console people who are contemplating the difficulties of life, and particularly the loss of family and friends, and to help inspire myself and them and all of us in those moments toward becoming purpose makers, toward becoming reconcilers, toward becoming joint heirs in the glory of God with each other.
Sure. Well, it definitely doesn't seem like you're trying to ride over Joseph Smith and completely, reword everything that he said, but it's more just kind of like this is how I think Joseph Smith would have said it if he was alive today.
Yeah.
Kind of an idea.
Yeah. I as we mentioned earlier, I do think that, I don't know about explicitly a name or not, but in function for sure, if Joseph Smith were alive today, people would recognize him as something of a transhumanist. I think he would be a huge fan of the potential of the technologies we have. He would also raise legitimate concerns about the risks, as we all should. And we shouldn't be merely technological cheerleaders. But I do think that he would recognize the power of technology, the role it can play in being the power and action and work to our faith in unprecedented ways. And I think that he would encourage us all to see it that way. And in function, that would be transhumanism.
All right, awesome. And so, as the last thing I want to get into, as you see the church today, how do you see the future of it looking like? Like, do you think the church is is really just going to ramp up and become super technologically advanced, and we're just going to be gathering more. We're going to see some technology in the future that help us to gather more names. Kind of an idea.
I hope so. I'm not deterministic about it, fatalistic about what the church must become. I think it depends on
Sure,
us.
it isn't about what the church must become, but I think it's about what is the trajectory the church is already taking, and if your book has any influence on it.
The trajectory of the church presently is very positive towards technology. We've reached a point in time where the church has had difficulty growing in educated portions of the world, and I think that's a problem that we need to resolve and can resolve.
Sure, it's absolutely booming in Africa, but
yeah,
as far as like Europe and America, it seems to be stalling a little bit, and we need to help up with that.
yeah, and I think that Joseph Smith and many subsequent leaders of the church gave us tools that we can use, if we will, to solve those problems. We don't have to keep talking about our religion and the gospel of Jesus Christ in the same way that worked 50 or 100 years ago. We can and should change the ways that we talk and we attempt to persuade and inspire people. And some of those things, well, I'll name one in particular that I think that we need to emphasize more, and that is theosis. We need to emphasize more the divine potential of humanity, that we're all children of God with potential to become as God is. We need to emphasize that more in practical ways, help people understand that the way that the world is changing right now has enormous risk and great opportunities associated with it, and that this is all part of the vision of the potential of humanity. I think if we would talk about those things that make our religion, our church unique, more unique among Christian denominations, that it would actually empower our missionaries more than trying to use rhetoric and tactics that worked better 5 decades ago.
It definitely feels like, even though theosis is basically the central theme of the church, there are still so many people in the church that are still, whenever you bring up the subject, they start to get a little bit weird about it. And so I definitely feel like we need to normalize it a lot more.
Yeah, I agree. We need to normalize it. We need to celebrate it. We need to help people understand how it's practical. It's not just magic. And when we start persuading each other and inspiring each other of the practicality of how we approach godhood, and I'm not talking about just power, I'm talking about compassion and courage and creativity. When we persuade and inspire each other toward godhood in that way, it will have, I really think, amazing impact on our missionary efforts, because that message is so persuasive. It's so moving. It's so transformative. That message changes people when they understand and internalize it.
Awesome. All right. So, you want to give any closing thoughts on everything that we've been talking about?
I guess one thing comes to my mind right now, and that is, hey, Lincoln has said that these ideas are transformative and they change people.
Sure.
Is there any proof of that? Yes, there is. There have been and continue to be people who have either joined the church or returned to the church, have become Mormon or returned to Mormonism because of Mormon transhumanism. It restored my faith, my belief. It has brought people who weren't members of the church into the church. One of my close friends left the church, asked to have his name removed, and for various reasons, among them Mormon transhumanism, he ended up deciding to come back to the church. He asked me to baptize him because he had been removed. He had to get permission to be rebaptized. These ideas are effective. They're practical for reestablishing faith, for maintaining faith, for strengthening faith. And there are many real world examples of that. So I hope people will take it seriously.
Yeah, and the more I learn about it, the more I take it seriously. All right, so for the one or two people that are watching, this is the book I got. There's a link down in the description box where you can go and get it. It's a really great. It's got some interesting AI images in it, like that. That's a great photo right there.
Worlds without end.
Yes, it's the worlds without end. It's the paintings you wish you could do if you had the talent.
Yep.
But you just use AI instead. And AI, just like everything else, is just a tool, and it depends on how we use it. But it seems like it has its uses, some pretty effective uses there. All right, so thank you so much for coming on, and I hope to talk to you later.
Thank you, Stephen. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Sure. Have a good one.
Later.